Hey everybody, it's Nick. I got a tutorial for you today that is VRay Next. So there's a few VRay tutorials that are out on the YouTube channel. This one is the latest as of fall 2019. There's been some changes to the VRay workflow. They're minor compared to the one from last year, but things are still different and actually better. So I'm going to take you through it, and I'm going to consolidate a few other topics from some videos, basically just to give you an understanding of how rendering works as a principle in architecture and with the computer, and how VRay Next works. So to work with this, you're going to have to get the file from Canvas. It's just called model.3dm. This is the file that you're going to use for the next two assignments. It's a model that I found on like an online repository. But it's just a building. It has a camera that's called demo, and it's pretty. Oops, I mean to do that there. Jumping the gun here, but it's a pretty standard kind of apartment, kind of condo complex. No big deal. It's kind of a pool or whatever. A couple things to note about it. It has this large kind of surface object. Remember, the ground is really important in anything architectural, so that the building doesn't just kind of float. Okay, very important. It also needs something, and gets into rendering right away. Remember, the way that rendering works on the computer is that it simulates the way light works. Like it's gonna shoot photons or light rays from a light source like a sun, and they cast shadows and they get illuminated. But there's also like secondary and tertiary bounces that happen with the light. If you don't have a ground, there is nothing for things to bounce off of, and you're going to get a very much less lit scene. You think about this when you think about photographing people or objects, you have like reflectors. Same principle, right? So the ground is really key. So I just have this giant like plane that I made for the thing to sit on. But I'll also note as you work, the building, if you look at it, like does not quite fit into the ground. You can see this line right here. It kind of sits in the ground a little bit. So just be aware of that when you're working with a model, that it's not exactly a perfect fit. But kind of take a tour around the building, just to kind of understand it. Obviously, the very first image of it, there's these kind of nice terraces, negative, but there's also these stairwells. There's these other kinds of decks here. There's these kind of columns that are offset. So there's kind of a back terrace as well, in addition to this kind of area. So there's some different kind of spaces in there that you're going to be able to take some renderings of. It's not the greatest like building, but it certainly has a few interesting options. So um, the idea of rendering though is like I talked about with cameras in Lab 8, is that rendering is not the last thing that you do with a project. It's something you do like as you design the building. So here I have a camera that's like a view that I think is very important to the building. I can see what the effect of the sun is on the form of the building and on the way the space is read. Remember, like light is really what creates space, like in a way. It gives us depth. It shows us like the kind of character of the materials and the textures. Rendering is great because it's like a simulation of what the building might look like when it's done. And the great thing about using the computer is that it's very easy and very inexpensive to make changes and see what the results are. And so rendering is a design tool. It's not something that you kind of design the building and then the last day before class you like make your renderings. It's really not. I don't want you to get that kind of attitude. So design your cameras, start working on some basic renderings, and let that be a guide as you design the building. Like it's not even just about the way you select materials. Like a lot of times that's the only time you really look at materials for the building is like when you're trying to render it the night before, and that's also not a good idea. Renderings are part of the art. I mean, the materials are part of the architecture, and you've really got to be thinking about those choices like as you go. The way my file is laid out, I just have what I call kind of basic, which is just some dumb stucco material or something, or made out of like styrofoam and then glass. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to this building. Like you can see that there are some vertical panels, there are some lintels, there are these kinds of doors with these pieces. There's like parapets like on the roof. There's a lot more hierarchy to it than simply opaque and transparent and like ground. And I want you guys to explore that. You also have like these low walls, railings, and you've got these You could consider these glass panels. There's a pool. There's all kinds of places to even explore the way that the materials actually change the reading of the building. Um, Rendering is definitely a place where when I was a student, I learned a lot about design because you have to think about the light, you have to think about the materials, and you have to think about the cameras and the kind of pictures that you're taking with the computer. And the lighting, materials, and rendering are part of the architecture. It's not just about getting the model done, like getting the form done, like that kind of stuff. And so rendering, I think, is a really great tool. So again, I've said it like a million different ways. So to that end, what I want you guys to be working with is to actually start to take the building, lay some cameras out, like at least 3 different cameras, and rearrange the materials on the building in three different styles or 3 different attempts, and make that 3 different files. And in order to do that, I'm gonna have to take you through the kind of rendering workflow. So I'll go back to the first camera here. I go to demo, and then I'm going to go into render and go to current renderer, VRay for Rhino. Okay, if you don't change the renderer, none of this is going to like work. Okay, now it's set to VRay. So you go to VRay, you got all these panels up here, all these tools. They're duplicated in this panel. If you don't have this, you don't really need it. You can always turn it back on by going up to the toolbars. I always get confused by this. Yeah, go to toolbar, and you should be able to open up the VRay. Where they are? Yeah, VRay for Rhino. Yeah, VRay all. There you go. And then they pop right back up. So no big deal. I don't really need them very much. Go to VRay. The thing you're going to be working with the most is called the asset editor, and it's kind of the control panel for the whole thing. And you got to pay attention to the controls. So there's all kinds of ways that they try to hide things to make it simpler, but it ends up being kind of confusing. So this little arrow here is you can open these things up and you can actually close them. Okay. The one that you're going to be spending the most time in is the settings. And this will work differently for different computers, but a lot of the times, like, we're going to either use the CPU or the GPU render. CPU is the central processing unit. It's the computer itself, the processor. The GPU is the graphics processing unit. That's your graphics card or your graphics chip that's on your computer. Some of your laptops have GPUs that work with VRay, and some of you do not. This year, the MacBook seems to work well with it. In previous years, you had to disable it. So if you're having problems, like it's not rendering or it's black or whatever, just change it back to CPU. I'm going to go ahead and try GPU for now. And what I want to start with is the interactive renderer. Rendering is something you have to think about as you work. In addition to making sure that you start rendering as part of your workflow within the design process, you've got to start your renderings early in any case. You really do not want to start rendering these things the night before things are due. Rendering takes time with your computer. You'll hear the fans probably going off as I'm working. It's really computationally intensive. It's going to use all your cores, all your RAM. Like, it's doing a lot of calculations in order to create that simulation of light and texture and materials. Renderings can take, depending on your settings, they can take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, depending on how complicated it is. Your scene could take a few hours. When I was a student, my stuff took all night. Things are getting faster, but you've really got to plan ahead. You've got to deliver 9 renderings for this assignment. That's no joke. Even at 10 minutes each, that's 90 minutes. So just pay attention to that, and also pay attention to the fact that, like, as you're rendering, you may not be able to use your computer as well. It may be taking more resources, so photoshopping or other things might not be taking place at the same time. So just kind of bear that in mind. Anyway, go back to VRay here. So if I go into my asset editor, I'm going to go ahead and turn on interactive rendering. Now, interactive rendering is important because instead of waiting for the computer to make a really detailed rendering, you can make a rough rendering fairly quickly. So again, you're going to turn on interactive, and then what you're going to have is the teapot with the little finger on it. That means you're in interactive mode. And the teapot in rendering just means to render. We can talk more. That's a little piece of digital trivia, but the first object that they used to render things with, that they used to test rendering on, was a teapot. It says it has lots of curves and reflections, and so, teapots. A little more trivia: there's a teapot in every Pixar movie. Okay, so we're gonna render the scene, and you can see the frame buffer is gonna come up, and you've got more or less a picture of this thing. I'm gonna go ahead and maybe hide this here. Yeah. So it's 320 by 240. It's very small. The larger this gets, the slower it renders, so that's probably a good size. And if you notice, as I move my scene, oops, it's going to kind of fade in this rendering here. Like it's going to finish. Just takes a little bit of time to kind of defuzz. The more complex your scene, the more materials, etc., the slower that preview is going to be, but it's way faster than a final rendering. But it's also not suitable for a final rendering. You can see it's like fuzzy. It'll reach a certain point where it's kind of finished its business, and it'll stop processing. But it's always going to be pretty fuzzy. If you're in a jam, like if you really need to get some stuff out for review, or you just have just want a quick crit, you can go ahead and save that as an image, whatever's in your DisplayPort. Okay, if you need it, like that's available to you. But so that's the way the interactive renderer works. But let's see how we can make that like a little bit better. So some of the things, let's see. The first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna put a sun in your scene, and sun is just the sun command in Rhino. VRay uses the Rhino sun, so sun, and you have to turn the sun on. Boom! Look at the sun. Good morning. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's go back to our view. This is a pretty good rendering already, and I'll talk about that. So you've got shadows. You've got the shadows are attached, to the objects. They're cast pretty far. Shadows give you a sense of the shape. If you have a sun that's directly overhead, like we can just go to manual here. If the sun is if it's like noon, and the sun is really high. First of all, it's kind of blown out. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you don't have a lot of shadows, right, you don't really get a sense of the size of the objects. Like you need a little bit of depth to things by having the shadows, actually be like cast. Okay, so pay attention to that. There's a reason why a lot of photographs are taken, like between, sometimes they're taken like very early in the day or very late in the day. It's because the light is illuminating a side, and you got these nice shadows. One thing that you get also is you get this different kind of coloration. You get the kind of golden color. You'll notice as you go further through the day, it gets like whiter. And that's because the sun's rays are going through like air pollution, and the wavelength is changing like slightly, and you just get those kinds of properties. And as you can see, like before the sun sets, it gets very, very golden. But you always want, like in a rendering, we haven't talked about this, but all the rules of cameras apply. You want good angle, you want good depth, you want good camera height, you want to have like a good foreground, middle ground, background. Vertical's locked if you can help it. But now we're looking at the way that light helps us read form. So, you've got pockets of contrast, like very brightly lit things, very darkly lit things, but not so much light or so much exposure that you blow out things. You can see this is pretty blown out. Now we haven't done any materials or anything, so this is not exactly fair. But the way that the rendering works, again, is that it's a simulation of the way light operates. There is a sun object which we just created, and it casts these rays. The rays bounce around in something called global illumination. If you turn off global illumination, or GI, it's almost like a cartoon. All you're getting are like the direct shadows. You're not getting the contributions of the light bounces. Really different, right? But the way these scenes are made up is of direct light and indirect light. You really need both for a realistic scene. If you want a more stylistic scene, this would actually be a pretty good start. It's not that bad, right? So that's something that could be kind of useful. But anyway, so the other way that it operates is that it treats the digital camera like a physical camera, at least the way VRay operates. So what that means is that there's an exposure level. Remember, the way cameras work, or the way they used to work, is that you had film, and it gathered light, and that was the exposure. And by adjusting the amount of light that the film took in and the amount of time that it took to gather that light, you could brighten or darken a photograph without actually brightening or darkening what it saw. Okay? So you can simulate the effect of letting in more light or less light by changing the EV or exposure value. And EV, you can see as I kind of go very high EV, you kind of blow everything out. If you have a very low EV, you're not going to get, well, you'll get it better actually. Sorry, if you go too low, let's see, or sorry, too high, you don't see much. Okay, so our scene was like 13.9 something, 92. Okay, depending on the material, that might be too much glare. So what you could do is dial that up, to 15 or something. Remember, you can adjust some of this in Photoshop, but if you've blown things out, you've got nowhere to go. You're not going to get that detail back. So if you had to, I would go for a higher EV and then Photoshop some of these things later if you need to. Obviously, you don't want to go too low. So that's something to bear in mind. And it doesn't, in the settings that we have, it does not really automatically adjust for the different times of day. You really got to kind of adjust it as you go and pay attention to those settings as you render. The materials will make a difference. Okay, so pay attention to that. But that's how those settings like really work. You don't need to worry too much about the rest of these settings. At least if with response to the assignment that we have. So there's that. The other thing you want to pay attention to. So this is I just have the sun. I had manual control on. A lot of times you actually will be doing these with a specific site in mind. So what you're going to do is go to the date and time. You can dial in the location. You can try to locate it using the here thing if you want. Let's see if Des Moines. Yeah, Des Moines right there. So we can go Des Moines, close enough. And that'll put in the latitude and longitude for it. And then you can actually set the time of day as well. So this is what this would look like right now. You could change it to something sunnier like June. And, maybe later in the day or something. Depends. Let's see where those shadows are. You can see that the positions of the shadows have kind of changed a bit. You've got to pay attention with your model to which direction north is. In this case, I've actually got north pointing up. If you need to adjust it, you can go ahead and adjust that here. You could say that north is in another direction, for example. Okay, it's just that's depending on your model. Either rotate your model or rotate north in the sun options. I would rotate your model. I would always leave north to be 90 degrees because it's just really confusing if it's not. So that's how you get an actual location for an actual place and time with those settings. Remember, I want three different sets of materials. You might also play with the time of day depending on the materials. It's up to you. Okay, so all that should be pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. So that takes us through basic rendering setup and light. The next thing I want to talk about are materials, and I'm going to go into, let's see here. Everything's always different here. So I'm going to go to, let's see. Yeah, materials. Okay. So the default materials in here, VRay actually has a variety of materials that are already built in, which is one of the things that's really nice about it. Let me see here. So I'm going to go into create and let's see here. Material generic. Wait a minute. Okay, so this is one of these things that gets you. You got to go ahead and click on this little arrow here, and you're going to go into materials. And instead of this generic materials, just go ahead and get rid of that. You can find these other materials. So, for example, and these are different bricks, concrete. You go to concrete, stone, glass. This will get you a lot of materials from the get-go, and I would just go ahead and stick with these for now. You can create your own materials. You can download materials. I don't want to mess with that stuff too much, but let's go ahead and go ahead and get something like a simple concrete, and we'll get some glass. I'll just get some regular and don't go too crazy right now. We'll talk about this more later, but let's just do window glass, maybe some brick. And all I'm doing is just clicking and dragging these in here. Okay. So the way that materials like work, I'm gonna take you through like a really kind of quick example of something here before we get too far away. I'm gonna go ahead and hide everything. I'm just gonna make a box just to give you a sense of what's possible here. Wow, that camera is really something there. Okay. Okay, and I'm gonna go back to my sun because it's give me some light. There you go. That's better. Okay, got a box. Now I'm gonna go ahead, and it's helpful to organize your file by layers because it makes it easier to apply the materials. You don't have to apply each material to each thing. I would go ahead later on and divide your model up into, like the way basically I would take from the basic layer and divide that up into the elements you want, like doors or like window sills or something like that. I just gave you these to start with, but if you've got something on a layer, it's really easy to like just apply all this material to that layer. I'm not going to do that right now, though. I'm just going to apply it to the selection. So if you apply it to the selection, you're like, okay, well, that's pretty good, but look at that. Like that's stretched over that object. It just doesn't look right. And that's because there's no texture coordinates. There's no texture mapping. Textures are flat. This is one of these things that we just have to deal with, like in the computer. So we have two-dimensional textures, like just basically like XY coordinates, right? Maps. And we wrap them onto objects like kind of Christmas paper in order to give them additional depth and material. You can see that there's like a little bit of kind of fake kind of shadow in here. That's just simulated. There's not actually anything. But you can see that there's this kind of indication. That's what's called a bump map, and it's just there's a combination of like a diffuse map, which is the color, like so like diffuse is the color, and bump is the diffuse, and bump mapping is the texture. And you can see that makes a big difference in the way that reads. But it's absolutely fake. If you look at the edge of it, you're not going to see this like mortar doing anything. It's just an illusion. Okay. Those are the other one that you might look at is like opacity mapping, and that is a map that's black and white that controls what's see-through and what's not. You may see that, you may not. I would not use any material that's like grass or anything that has to do with the displacement mapping. Displacement mapping actually distorts the geometry, and it takes a lot of memory, and it'll slow your file down. So anything that's got displacement, just turn that off or don't use displacement because it's just not worth it right now for the amount of time we have for the assignment. But for now, I got the bricks, I got the diffuse map, you can see like if you don't have a diffuse map, so that's just the bump map. That's the only contribution of the bump map. If I have the diffuse map on, you get both of them. Reflection and refraction, we don't have to really worry about. We're not doing a lot of that stuff. Okay, so I got the bricks. I put them on the object, but I don't have any mapping. And in order to do that, I got to go into the object, and I go to its properties, and I go to texture mapping. And a lot of times when you have objects, you're either going to use surface mapping or planar mapping or box mapping. You rarely use spherical, you rarely apply cylindrical mapping. Those are very specific types. Basically, you want to find the object that, the mapping type that most closely matches the object that you want to wrap a texture in. Box mapping will work pretty often because a lot of times in architecture our things are boxes. Even if your object is not a box, but it has like kind of a height, width, and depth, that's probably the best thing. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the box mapping. And you'll see up here, it asks you for first corner of base or bounding box, diagonal, I would just use bounding box. Just click on bounding box. Coordinate system is world. Capped, yes it is. And now you can see instantly that's already looking so much better because it actually fits the object. Now you can say, well, like, oh, I'm done. Well, maybe not. Like maybe that's a very, very large object or a very, very small object. What you're going to want to play with are either, well, you can play with the XYZ size, and you can play with the like repetition, and I'll kind of take you through both. This is set to the size of the object. Like whatever you map it to, it's just going to stretch that object. You can see right now that these bricks on this side are stretched more than the bricks are on this side, right? And again, that's just because you took the same map and stretched it over that area. So, for example, I could go in and I could say that like, well, this dimension's like 20, and this dimension is 20. Now I've actually got bricks on these two sides that are the same. Okay? But what if, and that just means that like it's 20 units for one tiling of the map. And you just have to eyeball it, guys. Like I think that's the only way. If you designed the texture yourself, like if you made it from a photograph or you downloaded it or like whatever, then you could probably not have to eyeball it. But I just think your eye is good enough. Now the question would be though is that like, well, what scale is it? And in order to affect that, all you have is the one tile. So if I go back and I say that that's 10, right? That's gonna affect that dimension. The other way you can do it is just to repeat it. So UVW is texture space. XYZ is like model space. UVW, so XYZ UVW, right? And so you can change the tiling of it. So I could say 2 times the X tiling, or 2 times the Y tiling, or 4 times the Y tiling. Okay, so by adjusting those dimensions and those tiles, you can get the effect that you want. Okay, don't the W and Z, we really don't use those very often, but I mean obviously you can kind of play with it to get what you want, but a lot of times we don't really bother with it. If you want there to be a different texture on the top, then you've got to explode that thing and then apply a different material. I keep doing that to the top of your object. So you can go back to the asset editor, and you could apply, a new material to that. But you've got to explode that object. You can't apply different materials to an object, at least not easily. You have to get into like material subgroups and all that stuff, and that's beyond the scope of the class. Same thing applies though to this concrete, texture up here. You've got to map it. You've got to apply some mapping to get it to work the way you want it to. Okay, let's go ahead and blow these away, and let's take a look at the model again. Let's show the model. So like right away, something I could do really easily is just go to glass, and I could say apply to glass. You probably you might notice it actually does slow things down slightly when I've applied the glass material. That's because it has to handle the reflections of the scene. It has to basically create a rendering of the scene and then reflect it or calculate the reflection of it in the glass in order to generate that. And that depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the angle that you're viewing the glass at, and it depends on the complexity of the scene, and it depends on the type of material that you have. If you've got a glass, I'm trying to find one. Like if you've got a glass that's like really like funhousey, it might take more time. You can also create glass that's like more or less mirrored. I want to say this crystal glass is actually pretty intensive. Yeah, you can kind of see it struggling like back here. There's a lot more refraction in their crystal glass than in just the neutral window glass. And you get the hang of it, but that's not a bad thing to be looking at. Also, of course, like the time of day, the more glare you're going to get off of that material is going to change the properties of that glass. But this is a really great thing about rendering, is that you learn about the ways that glass behaves because it is being simulated physically. So you can see how if you're looking straight at, something and the interior is dark, how the glazing is actually black, or it appears black in that space. This is what I talked about when we did like the exterior renderings, when we did the elevation drawings. You can also see that when you're coming at glass, from a side angle or there's light, you can see the glass it's kind of like frosted a bit. Like it's got kind of what do I call it? It's kind of translucent as opposed to totally transparent, and that just depends on the angle that you approach the glass at, right? And so that's something that I learned, when I was experimenting with these digital materials. They behave the way that physical materials behave, so that's pretty cool. Okay, we go back to that. So a couple other things. So let's go ahead and apply a concrete texture to this wall here, and you can get a sense of what that looks like. This is something I see students do all the time with this project. So that right now is one texture just kind of stretched on there, and you might say that you like that, but it's actually not. It's not very good. Actually, the light really blows it out. Holy cow! Let me make sure that that's even on there. Apply to selection. Oops. Yeah. No, I don't know. Somehow I lost that. Okay, so there it is. I think I must have accidentally undid it or something. Now, what you've got to pay attention to with that again is the texture mapping. So, yeah, I guess I must have mapped this one. Yeah. So you're going to go into that object and again go into the properties of the object. Go to the texture mapping. Going to go ahead and box map it. And bounding box, world, cap it. Sure. Now that's going to change it, but you can see how it just stretches that thing. So that's because the X size is so large, like it's just ridiculous. So I might go by one of the other dimensions, like I might call it 7 or something. Just go ahead and make these all the same. And you gotta kind of eyeball it to see what. And actually, this camera is not doing any favors right now. There we go. That's better. You can probably hear my fan, and you can see how it's kind of struggling to keep up sometimes. That's because it is really working pretty hard here. Hang on a minute. Yeah, so I don't know. Let me get my camera adjusted here. Yeah, I'm not sure how I like that. So I might make the texture bigger, but then tile it more. You got to think about the concrete's going to have these like little pits in it and stuff, and it's going to have. Let me get even closer to it. Oops, too close. Okay. Yeah, so that might be too tiled. You don't If you tile it too much, then you'll see the seams like in the texture from like one side to another, and you definitely don't want that like either. So you gotta kind of play it by ear. And then of course I think my sun once again is probably too it's probably too bright. So it's not too bad. We'll go ahead and go with that for now, just to keep moving on here. But basically, you want it to look like concrete and not look like you stretched a thing over the concrete. You can say, Nick, that stinks. Like that's really tedious, and that takes a long time. Well, you can map several objects at the same time. Like this is another reason why it really makes sense to get everything grouped together. So it just makes it a lot easier. So you can group all these together and put them on a layer, and then you can apply the material to those objects. Um, if you go into VRay, yes, you can say apply to layer. I'm just going to apply it to the selection for now. Now you can see that I've applied it, but look at all that stretching and stuff like that. That doesn't look very good at all, like compared to this, right? Well, you can say, well, that's like terrible. How do I'm gonna have to do mapping for everything. Well, not necessarily. You can actually get the mapping from another object, and that can really help quite a bit too. So um, let's take a look at that. So I'm gonna go ahead and say apply box mapping, and I'm gonna do bounding box, world coordinates, capped, mapping channels one. Um, yeah, And what you can do is just you can say match mapping, and then you're just going to choose the source object, and you choose the channel that it was on, and that should all pop in. So now it's all mapped the same way. Okay. Something else I didn't really talk about. Sorry for all the windows and stuff. Is that you can also look at the mapping like visually. So I've got the thing selected. I can go in and I can say show mapping. And so this box right here represents the 30 unit by 7 unit. That's where the tile the material starts as. That's what it gets started as. It starts at. It comes in from VRay to that dimension. If I change those dimensions, now you can see what that looks like, right? And that's where the origin is. That's where it's being tiled, and so it's 30 by 30 by 7 tiled 4 times. Okay, if you go into that, go into my mapping again. Scroll up to the top here, so you can show, excuse me, you can show that mapping, um, and that can be helpful just to kind of visualize the size of the of where the texture is being applied. But anyway, so that's just kind of a visual indicator. You can also go in and rotate it too. So like you can actually take the box here, and you can actually undo this here, and so you can actually, if there was a reason to, you can actually rotate the texture coordinates to match that object. That's pretty uncommon, but that's something that's like possible, especially if you have like a label or like a decal for something. If you need help with that, let me know. But that's something that's why that's in there. So mapping can help you visualize stuff. You can also like scale it and stuff too if you need to, like if that helps you more. So you can go in and scale it, but again, that's probably going to get you in trouble right now. So that's where that comes from. Okay, so show. Okay, so I've got that, and that gives you the kind of basic idea of how to apply materials, how to select materials, how to change the sun, all that. So then, if we're all done, like let's say that we've got something that we like, you can go into your camera views. Remember to save your camera views. Always be designing things. One hint I will give you that's very important: only apply materials and textures and stuff for what's in your cameras. You do not need to apply materials and map materials for the entire building, right? If all you're going to see, for example, in one camera view is just this stuff like right here, all right? Don't material everything. It just takes too much time, and it's going to take more time for the computer to process. Focus on what's visible to the camera, and that's all you need to do. Okay, so when you're ready to output, you can go into the asset editor. I'm going to go ahead and close all this stuff up again. Go back to settings. You've got to stop the interactive rendering. This is actually still, it's constantly rendering, even as you're moving and stuff. So go ahead and hit stop. Then change the rendering type to turn interactive off, and then you can go into the render output. And I like the 4:3 is like 8.5 by 11. You can do widescreen, if you want something more cinematic. And then you can go ahead and change the aspect ratio and things like that. So like a good rule of thumb, I think a lot of times is 1600 for the width. 1600 by 900 is a pretty decent just for anything on the computer that you're going to see. You might make that bigger if you're going to output to something else. You might make it, I think it's like 1850 or something by, I can't remember what HD is. But anyway, you can make that larger or smaller. But I think 1600 by 900 is good for kind of middle of the road output. And then you're going to go ahead and say save image, and you just go ahead, and I'm going to throw this on my desktop, Nick test. And I like to save these as TIFFs. This is a tagged image format that gives you a lot of room to work with things when you're working in Photoshop. A target file is going to give you the background channel, like it gives you the alpha channel, which you guys know is really easy to like select things. That lets you change the sky really easily. So that can be really nice too. I might save it as a target. And then when you're ready, just go ahead and hit render. And now the paint begins. It's going to, these are buckets, and each bucket is an area of the image, and it's going to run some calculations, and it's going to sample the light in the image and the materials, and it's going to perform some calculations. And it does two passes. The first bucket pass is just kind of rough. It just generates the raw kind of sample data. And the second pass is like the refinement pass, and it's going to go in and smooth everything out. So if you're unhappy, this also gives you a chance to like stop the rendering. If you see things are not right, you can just go ahead and hit stop, and you can change it and then start over again. There's no reason why you have to finish the entire rendering. But this is just the way that these things are calculated. It's not a very complicated scene right now. I don't have a lot of extra lights. I don't have a lot of extra materials. What It will take more time depending on your model and depending on your processor speed, that sort of thing. So make sure to budget some time. This is probably going to take another, I don't know, another 90 seconds or so. Like I said, in your case, it'll probably take a little bit more time. So you can see though, like there's a little bit of aliasing here, a little bit of pixelation. Things are kind of rough, in places. So it's I believe the way I have it set up, it'll do more than one pass. So it'll do this kind of sample, and you can change these settings, and I'll talk about that really briefly before we go. But this is just how this proceeds, and you'll probably, I don't know if you can hear my computer fan, but you can hear it. It's a good idea to make sure that your computer has good like airflow at this time. You don't have to overheat, and it'll make your lap or your desk very hot. So be aware of that. All right, so almost done with this bucket, with this set of buckets. It often will save some of the higher detail things for later. It'll kind of do the middle of the image last, because it's depending on the data from like the rest of the image to do that. That's often the case. It might be. I might have it set to one pass. I don't know. I'll have to see. I also realized that this is only 50% of the image. It's not actually the full image. If I zoom in, it's probably less pixely. All right, almost done. Okay, I guess it's one pass. Yeah, so not too bad. Yeah, pretty good for this resolution. Our textures don't look too bad. So that's what that looks like. Again, that's 50%. This is 100%. So if I zoom in, that's not too bad. Let me check the settings again. So the settings, like right now, I have quality is kind of custom. You can see that like when you adjust, these things, it has the different. This is the size of the bucket, and then the number of subdivisions in the bucket. You definitely want anti-aliasing because that's what makes it smooth. I might go to CPU renderer and see if that doesn't change things a little bit. So let's just go ahead and render it again and see what the difference is. Yeah, see the buckets are a little bit smaller now, and I don't know if it's gonna do two passes or not. It's actually looks like it's outputting the same image. Let me see here if I can clear. Yeah, I'll just stop it. Say clear image. It's weird that it didn't completely erase the scene, but so be it. Yeah, there's lots of little settings that you can play with if you really want to tune your rendering. For you, since you're new to rendering, I would just rely on the high or ultra high settings depending upon the amount of time you have. And the only reason why you'd bump up, besides wanting the quality, is if you see little like crumbs, like little black blotches or like rendering artifacts, that means that the computer can't collect enough samples. And so that's where you would need to decrease the bucket size and maybe increase the number of passes in the image. That's going to get rid of those artifacts. The other places where they occur is like where you have really fine details, or like seams between objects. That's where you're really going to need more samples for each image. This looks like it might be a two pass image. We're not even at like 50%. I don't know. It's hard to say, I guess. We've only probably rendered about a quarter of the image on the screen anyway. A lot of times it'll do like a refinement, but this looks pretty good actually. So yeah, so it's I do think the quality's better with the ultra high setting, which makes sense. Custom setting is like if you've changed anything from one of the defaults at all, it's gonna call that custom. That's just what that means. That means you modified something, which is no big deal. Sometimes uh, you will want to do. Yeah, this is supposed to be one pass. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm gonna go back. If you really, if you want to experiment with a larger image because the viewport size on the interactive is too small, you can go ahead and just do like a quick like a draft image. Let's see what that gets you. Yeah, crunch crunch. So pretty fuzzy, but not too bad. You can see though you really don't get a lot of the detail like in like the glazing and stuff, and of course it's really fuzzy. So you can do that. To go back to interactive, just go click on the thing. Now you gotta change this back though because this is like way too big. Otherwise, what you're gonna get is an interactive rendering that's too large. So go back to like 320 by 240, and that'll give you your interactive render again. Let's confirm that that works. Yeah, that's fine. So pretty good. Back to the old interactive render. Okay. So the only other thing I would point out is just kind of a fun it's kind of a fun thing, but it's something that if I don't show it to you, you might not pick it up for a while. So I'm gonna go take the swimming pool. I'm gonna go back to materials, and I am going to get an emissive material. And emissive materials mean that they emit light. And so you can drop one of these things in here, and you can see that it actually creates light. With these things, like again, you can if you don't like the color, you can just change the diffuse color to green or something like that. You can certainly make simple modifications to them. Intensity is the amount of light that it puts out. To be clear, you're making a material that acts as a light source, and this is useful for like neon, or if you actually want to create your own light and then have an element in it, you can absolutely do that. It's pretty computationally intensive, but it's also pretty fun. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that material to the pool. And you can see that it's there, but we're not really getting the impact of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the sun, and I'm going to turn off the sun. And I've still got, let's see here, maybe I can set the sun or something like that. There we go. Yeah. So now you can kind of see the contribution of that. Let me go back to the rendering. So that's kind of ominous. It's kind of cool. Kind of Halloweeny. Like a big thing of toxic waste. You can see the reflection of the pool in the glass. It's weird though because there's no like it's just like a flat color. I don't really like that detail too well, but I'll play with that later. So if we go back to the settings for the let's go back to the environment here, and I think if we turn off the let's see if we can turn off the background. So that just turns off the sky. And then I think the other thing we'd probably do is turn off the if we have any daylight in the sun. Yeah, I think we can. There we go. So if we turn off, the contribution of the daylight a bit, you can really start to see daylight is the light that's not direct from the sun. So again, you can the good thing about this is that it simulates things and that can teach you something about the way the physical environment works. The bad thing, which can be okay for us, is that we can play with that. We can change what the contributions of the different things are, and we can fake things, but we just have to be careful not to convince ourselves that that's the way that it actually is. We can make great images and we can use them to talk about ideas, but they're not really truth. If you're really changing things, if you're not like paying attention to what the variables are, you can't pass it off as real. So this does a couple things. I mean, one, you can. So I went into the environment. If I go back to the setting here, I went into the environment setting. which is basically like the background and but also the light. If I go into that little checker box there, I can go in and I can change the intensity of the kind of daylight. I don't want to make this completely dark because then there's nothing for else for this. This is the only light source. That's not really true. There's probably some ambient kind of night light that's out there that's actually like like sort of like contributing to what the eye sees. Remember, the exposure is another thing that we can play with. But one thing I want to kind of note, and this is the reason I even did this in the first place, is if I go back to let me go back to the rendering again. And I won't make it too big. I'll probably make it like 720, whatever that ends up being. 720 is good because that's one of the lowest high def kind of numbers. Okay, so if I go back and I'm actually going to render it like a real rendering. Hang on a second. So yeah, but the trick is that let me zoom out a little bit. You can see how blotchy this all is. Let me see here. I don't think I actually rendered it though. Did I? Draft. Oh, I'm in draft setting. Okay. I'll do something actually here. If I go to interactive rendering, wait, you have to watch it. So it takes a long time for the light to gather. Like it's actually kind of calculating, and the noise level takes a long time to like process. You can see how it kind of distributes that light. It kind of smooths it out over time. But you can also see where there's gaps in it. And that's just because if it's the only light source, there's a lot of sampling that has to take place in order to smooth it out. And this will happen a lot of times with some of your renderings they're in the shade, and so that's why I even kind of bring it up. If you're doing interactive rendering, you might want to wait a little while before you decide whether it's working or not. So anyway, I'm going to stop that rendering. I'm going to go to CPU rendering. I'm going to a high rendering, and let's check out the difference between this scene and the last scene. And you can see it'll probably take a while per bucket before it can process that light. You can see how it totally ignores like this. It doesn't even, there's nothing in it. There's no nuance or shading or anything like that. It's the emissive material is just treated as kind of a flat color. So you got to be careful about how you use it. Well, that's not too bad actually. Like it's a little grainy, but I'm not getting splashes and things like I would have expected. So that's pretty good. If I was, like I said before, I'd have to go up to the ultra settings to get it to render. All right, so now I don't want everyone to do an emissive material for their submission. I just wanted to point out um, you have to pay attention to how these things like work. You can't just like apply a material and then render it. Like you've got to think about the settings. You got to think about the extra light that's in there and the way that it kind of works as a composition. There's some technical details as well that have to do with the way the image is rendered. You can see the kind of subsampling here, like the smaller buckets, in order to get a good image. But again, this is way easier than it used to be to render things. I think the settings have been really simplified. You can dig into things if you need to and like open things up. But really, it's actually not that hard to do. So let me go back to my old settings. Let's see here. Oh, another thing too is to make sure that if you're saving these images in this format, you have this switch on. It's going to overwrite your image, so be really careful with that. Otherwise, you can go into your frame buffer and then just like click save for each image. Okay, like I said, because otherwise it's just going to keep overwriting that image each time, and that's going to kind of ruin your day. So be very, very careful with that setting. I would probably just turn it off and then just save it. But the trick with this is you got to remember to click save after each time you render the image. So just be very disciplined about the way that you approach that, and it should work for you pretty well. Yeah. So again, make one file with the materials and the cameras for each set. So like 3 files, and then make your 3 renderings. And then put them together as a PDF, and that is the assignment. Okay, so if you have any questions about it, let us know in lab. Otherwise, hopefully that covers the gist of what you need. Pay attention to your camera angle and composition and your light. Make sure that you map your materials. I don't want to see materials that look like fake. And use materials in the way that they'd be used. Like, I don't want to see, like, for example, like a brick railing. Walls could be brick. Make sure that the lintels are a different material if you're using brick. Think about, the what kind of flooring or kind of like ground surface material that you would use. Try to divide things up into horizontal and vertical groups and structure and frame versus infill, transparent versus opaque. And try not to do things crazy like make walls out of orange juice or toxic waste pools or stuff like that. Okay, so hopefully that covers the basics of VRay and the basics of architectural rendering. We got a ways to go, but it's a good start. I'll see you in lab.